So what is brutalism? Brutalism wasn't a movement exactly, but it was a term applied to the architectural style of exposed rough concrete and large modernist block forms which started in the 1950s and flourished in the ensuing 20 years.
Brutalism or Brutalist architecture. The term brutalism was coined by the British architects Ellison and Peter Smithson. Brutalist architecture is a style of architecture which flourished from the 1950s to the mid-1970s, spawned from the modernist architectural movement. The term brutalism evolved from the French word brute, meaning raw. Examples of brutalist architecture can be found across Europe and in the United States, Australia, Israel, Japan, and Brazil. Brutalism is a 20th century architectural and artistic movement that emphasizes bold, confrontational, and bulky buildings which communicate strength, functionality, and power. The best known early brutalist architecture is the work of the Swiss architect Le Corbusier, Secretariat Building in Chandigarh, India, 1953. Brutalism is a post-war architectural style.
Brutalism wasn't a set of ideas that emerged after the Second World War. It's the exact opposite of the machine aesthetic championed by the early modernists. You can't straightforwardly do modernity anymore. You need something more human. The first brutalist building, the first one generally agreed as brutalist, is Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation. It's a huge concrete-framed, concrete facade, concrete structure. It has pilotis, which are columns which lift the whole structure off the ground, and it has an amazing sculptural roof. It's mainly flats, but with cafes and a school for residents too. It's not a pretty building, but it's an incredibly simple, powerful image. Anyone can draw it, having seen it for a few moments. Le Corbusier said that architecture was about establishing moving relationships with raw materials. In other words, brutalism is supposed to make you feel something. One of the most important people to write about brutalism is Reyner Banham. He got that brutalism was all about feeling. He wrote a long polemical essay in 1955 on the topic called The New Brutalism in the influential magazine The Architectural Review. Banham cited Le Corbusier on feeling at the start of his article. His essay says three things. First of all, it's about memorability as an image. Second, there's a clear exhibition of structure. And third, he writes that there is a valuation of material as found. You instantly get what a brutalist building looks like, you can see how it's made, and you can see what it's made of. All of these things added up to a kind of architecture which is really about feeling. It's about creating a felt impression primarily. So this is a very different way of looking at architecture from, say, the way Le Corbusier was thinking in the 1920s of a machine-like architecture. This is architecture to create feeling in the observer.
History of brutalism. First used in an architectural context by Swedish architect Hans Asplund in 1950, who discussed about New Brutalism. In 1954, Reyner Banham used the term more widely in his writings to refer to the work of English architects Ellison and Peter Smithson, who created the iconic Hunstanton School in Norfolk and later the Robin Hood Gardens in popular East London. The term brutalism came to refer to the functional raw concrete buildings emerging in the UK and London, in particular in the post-war period. Due to the relatively low cost of concrete, brutalism was popular for rebuilding government buildings and providing social housing in the period of social solidarity following the Second World War.
term brutalism was popularized by British architectural critics of the 1950s. While it's obvious to English speakers that the term was derived from the word brutal, meaning crude and harsh, it actually also originates from the French words béton brut, meaning raw concrete. Of course, not all concrete buildings are brutalist, and in fact, not all brutalist buildings are necessarily made of concrete, but a defining principle of brutalism is an overt focus on material itself and attention to the sculptural form. But brutalism is not just aesthetics, it's also a philosophy. In the mid-20th century, it became associated with the anti-bourgeois and socially progressive, and supporters of brutalist architecture saw them as bold monuments of egalitarianism and democracy. During the post-war decades of the 1950s and 60s, there was a strong reaction among many designers, architects, and the general public against both the overly ornamental styles of Beaux-Arts architecture as well as the rigid glass box forms of the international style. Many associated shiny glass towers with the wealthy, privileged elite, and to many progressive thinkers, brutalism was the more honest, unpretentious, and egalitarian approach to architecture. For the most part, brutalism was a favorite style of public or institutional buildings such as government facilities, libraries, universities, museums, and social housing. Concrete is a product that is relatively inexpensive, plentiful, and accessible. The heavy and enclosed building envelope with limited glazing made it easier for climate control, thus making it economically sensible and practical for institutional use, which in turn also symbolized a degree of modesty and public accountability. Brutalists placed heavy emphasis on the exposure of structural materials and celebrated the internal functional use of the building. This approach may not seem unique to us today, but at the time it was a departure from previous styles.
This is Denis Lasdun's National Theatre, completed in 1976 after quite a protracted building process, and Prince Charles thought it looked like a nuclear power station. Of course, it isn't a nuclear power station, but what Charles meant was that it was an industrial-looking building, something that was rather bleak and uncompromising, something that didn't look like a theatre. But that was the point. And the point of that National Theatre and many of the other structures on London's South Bank is to create a kind of arts complex which is not like the rest of the world. An arts complex which is tough and uncompromising and maybe makes you feel a little bit unsettled, sort of taken slightly outside of the everyday world. I would tend to think of brutalism more as an art tendency than anything else. The main monuments of brutalism are so much more than functional architecture, and how they work and what they want you to look at is surface, sculptural qualities. They want you to feel something, they want you to have an experience in relation to them, which is much more like an art experience. They want you to have an aesthetic experience. Brutalism is all about making you feel something.
Arts Library, a monstrous, multifaceted complex with the footprint of an equilateral triangle in the heart of University of Toronto's downtown campus. It houses the university's main humanities and social sciences library, and depending on who you ask, has been an iconic architectural monument, or the biggest, ugliest eyesore of the Toronto landscape for over 40 years.
Criticism. Brutalism has some severe critics, including Charles, Prince of Wales. His speeches and writings on architecture have excoriated brutalism, calling many of the structures piles of concrete. Much of the criticism comes not only from the designs of the buildings, but also from the fact that concrete facades do not age well in damp, cloudy, maritime climates such as those of the northwestern Europe. In this climate, the concrete becomes streaked with water, stains, and sometimes with moss and lichens, and rust leaches from the still reinforcing bars. In recent years, the bad memories of underserved brutalist community structures have led to their demolition in communities eager to make way for newer, more traditionally oriented community structures. Despite a nascent modernist appreciation movement and the identified success that some of these styles of springs have had, many others have been or slated to be demolished. The critics used to call the buildings cold-hearted, inhuman, hideous, and monstrous. Matthew Iglesias, a commentator at Think Progress, has argued that brutalist structures in Boston, such as City Hall, sort of kill pleasant urbanist neighborhoods. Resurgence. Although the brutalist architecture Although the brutalist architectural movement was largely dead by the mid-1980s, having largely given to structural expressionism and deconstructivism, it has experienced an updating of sorts in recent years. Brutalism has recently experienced a major revival in Israel due to the perceived sense of strength and security the style creates. Even in Britain, where the style was most prevalent, featuring significant amounts of exposed concrete, something that would have been regarded as aesthetically unacceptable back then.